Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of the Bookum Show. My name is Kyle Colley and this is a special episode of Author Talks Podcast, a podcast to hear the behind the scenes stories, ideas, and writing journeys of authors. This episode is brought to you by Bookum, the book community's new and best way to host dynamic online book clubs. Download the app and start your book club today at www.bookumapp.com. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. My guest today is the exceptional Dr. Marcia Chatelain. Dr. Chatelain is the author of Southside Girls and the Pulitzer Prize-winning book franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, the book we are discussing today. Dr. Chatelain serves as the Penn Presidential Compact Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a writer, an educator, a public speaker, an award-winning teacher, a James Bearden award-winning author, and a Chicago native. Dr. Chatelain, welcome to the Author Talks podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So I would love to start with a little bit before franchise. I want to talk a little bit about, I don't know if you've seen the movie Sinners, but I know your first book had the backdrop of the Great Migration, specifically Southside Girls. So I would just wanted to hear a little bit about, have you seen the movie? And if so, kind of what your thoughts were about some of the Great Migration in Chicago specifically.
It's funny. I'm so late on everything popular culture. I'm still like rewatching, or I'm still trying to watch like some Real Housewives seasons from before. So I'm late, but I just saw Sinners was available on my on an app on my TV. So I'm going to watch it. I know that people have been really blown away by this movie and its multiple references and its visuals, but I have not seen Sinners, but I do know a lot about the Great Migration. And I think a large part of like the issues in Sinners is about people staying in the South during this period of incredible racial violence and intimidation. And I think that is such an important part of the story because I think for many scholars, they're really fascinated about people who packed up their things and moved to Chicago, moved to New York, moved to Los Angeles. But I think that there's also a very important and compelling story about the people who stayed, right? The people who for whatever reasons, made a decision to stay rooted in the South. And their rootedness is so important because it helps build many of the political movements that we celebrate today, the civil rights movement, the Black nationalism movements, radical movements. They were also in the South. And so I think it's cool when movies really do focus on Black Southern communities.
Yeah, I agree, and it's cool because the two brothers kind of come back from Chicago, so and then they come back and try to, from their this kind of great migration era, they come back into the South and bring some of the stuff that they learned from Chicago, as well as just bringing in that whole southern roots. So, but speaking of Chicago, as we know, McDonald's is headquartered there. So growing up, I just want to hear kind of what your relationship was with McDonald's.
So I was a total 80s kid. I went to McDonald's all the time. We went to McDonald's like before and after church. That's where you hung out with your friends. And when I've been talking about my research on McDonald's, one of the contexts that I think is so important for people my age is before people had cell phones, you had to meet places in order to go to the next place, right? So you go to a McDonald's and then everyone goes to the movies like on the bus, or you meet at the McDonald's at, a mall downtown and then you go to the next place. So when people talk about McDonald's as a third space, for me, it was definitely a third space. It's where you studied after school. It's where people gathered. It's where people hung out. And so I was a big McDonald's person growing up and as a kid, and even through college and graduate school, McDonald's was the spot.
I got to live in Chicago a little bit last year, so I went to the headquarters and I got to see just how
Oh,
they
did
always
you?
do they always do these new different I mean all the menu items from around the world, which is really cool. Talk to me a little bit about how fast food those habits are kind of developed at a young age. Because at least for me, I know that McDonald's kind of was like a celebration meal. Like on Fridays, we
Mhm.
go to McDonald's. You got to go to the place set, and that's kind of how I would say my affinity kind of started with McDonald's. And as you kind of got older, it became more something you ate more regularly. And then now I have a different a relationship with McDonald's. So I'm kind of curious how those fast food habits kind of start at a young age.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why McDonald's is an industry leader is because it was one of the first companies that really understood how to market directly to children. That it went from a place where people were encouraging their families to a place where you targeted children and you hope that children would bother their parents so much and annoy them so much they would just take them to McDonald's. So McDonald's really was very adept at building the habit of talking to children directly, creating worlds for them with the characters and with the Ronald McDonald figure, as well as the Happy Meal, so that kids felt like it was a place where they had a level of autonomy and freedom, even though they needed their parents' money to get there. And so I think that, that model continues, even in places that aren't fast food. Yesterday for Father's Day, I took my husband and son out for breakfast, and the kids' menu had the coloring sheet, and there's a sense that children eat something different. Those sensibilities really do come out of the fast food industry, and they help create these long-term affinities that even as you get older and your palate may change and the food does not hit the same way as it used to when you were a kid, those memories and those desires to create memories with your own children become a large part of how these companies continue to thrive.
That's a good point. And what was the eating habits of Black America before McDonald's started kind of penetrating those urban neighborhoods? Did you have any? What was the research like for pre-McDonald's in those spaces?
That's such a great question because so many times when I talk to people about McDonald's and Black communities, people will say or they'll assume that, Black communities had all this great, healthy, nutritious food, and then McDonald's came in. And that's a little inaccurate. I think because of racism and because of segregation, because of those types of inequalities, Black communities have always struggled to get a wide array of nutritious and healthy foods in their community. So even if we look in the South where people will say, well, in an agricultural context, people could grow their own food. No, they didn't. They didn't have ownership of their own land so much so that they could grow whatever they want and keep it. You had a lot of people who were sharecroppers who would eat whatever their sharecropping boss let them have or let them grow, or what they couldn't sell at market that they could bring back home. People may not have had diets in what we call processed foods, but people didn't necessarily have well-rounded diets either because poverty always limits what you can eat and what you have access to. So what we saw prior to McDonald's was people trying to make it through sometimes government assistance foods, donated foods, or supermarkets in Black communities, especially in the North, were often targets of a lot of protest activities because they would charge people higher prices for lower quality goods.
Speaking to the protest part, one of the things I found the most interesting is because when you think about these sit-in moments, you think of just diners, right? Just like these old Southern diners. You don't think about McDonald's as being the place where these big protest sit-ins were happening. Can you talk about some of those civil rights era moments before, obviously, the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968? But can you just talk about what made those moments and those sit-ins effective at McDonald's specifically?
Yeah, I was in the same boat. I had never thought of McDonald's as the target of sit-in activities or anti-segregation protests. I always thought it was Woolworth's lunch counters, like we see those iconic photos from companies that we really don't have anymore, like Cress's Drugs, Rexall. So I thought it was just an old school kind of businesses. But when I started doing my research, I was looking at the work of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that developed out of the sit-ins in 1960, and McDonald's is one of their targets. And McDonald's is a serious target for SNCC because they're seeing the expansion of the franchise model throughout the South. And so McDonald's restaurants throughout North Carolina, in Memphis, Tennessee, and Pine Bluff, Arkansas, they are places where Black civil rights organizations are protesting, and they're saying you're segregating customers, or you're having these policies where, all the white customers have to be served first before Black people's orders could be taken. A lot of these restaurants didn't have like eat-in facilities. You had to drive your car in. So even in a model where people aren't even sitting next to each other, you still see the use of segregation policies to try to keep people in their place. And I had never, ever, ever in my many years of, studying the civil rights movement had ever seen McDonald's as a target. But once I started looking for it, it became clear to me, of course, it would be a target because it was one of many businesses that was expanding throughout the 1950s and prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yeah, it blew my mind because I was sitting there like, no, I forget. You don't think about that, but it is right there in that moment. And it's blowing up right then because McDonald's obviously in the 50s is starting to take off, and then Ray Kroc comes in, the one of the ultimate. If you've seen the movie, the founder, he becomes
Mhm.
the whole founder of the McDonald's. But talk to us specifically about Pine Bluff because that one it seems like you highlighted a lot. Can you talk about just the violence and just the overall results from that moment?
Yeah, I think that's the thing that's also important to remember that these protests against segregation wasn't just about people kind of, sitting in a seat. It was making themselves targets of violence. The Pine Bluff, Arkansas movement had been organized partially by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the local NAACP, and they claimed that Black Muslims were involved in that protest. I'm not entirely sure that was accurate, but that's what people were saying. And so in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a group of students from Arkansas Agricultural and Technical College, they start to protest the segregation policies of McDonald's. And on one July 4th weekend, when they do this protest, people go inside of the restaurant to try to order to see if they'll get served. And they're essentially locked, chained into that restaurant. And they see that they've turned off all of the air conditioning, they've made it really, really hot. And then when the police finally open the doors, they're arresting people, they're beating people. Someone threw acid in a woman's face. This is how high stakes this stuff is. And so from my perspective, I think it's really important to try to ask the question, how has McDonald's been written out of that history,
Mm.
right? Like we know these companies that were targets of segregation that continued to exist even, after the end of the protest. But why is it that we never make this association with McDonald's in light of the fact that such dramatic and violent protests happened at the site of one of its restaurants?
Yeah, and just the overall, because I think what makes reading your book so incredible is because I read, because we have a founders club, so we read Grinding It Out by Ray Kroc, and when
Mhm.
they talk about McDonald's, they talk about how amazing it was, and everything kind of started working out, and you never really think about how much Black people contributed to the overall, because now McDonald's serves over a billion, people, and the fact that McDonald's largely started penetrating these urban communities, Black communities during, specifically even when you talk about the assassinations of Martin Luther King in 1968. So how did those kind of moments help kind of start this Black franchise ownership in McDonald's?
So immediately after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., people are starting to ask a lot of questions. For those of you who remember the types of conversations people were having after the killing of George Floyd, they were very similar. What is business's responsibility? What do we do about economic and financial inequality? People are asking, what can we do? How do we make sure that corporations see themselves as socially responsible actors, the same types of conversations. And so, what McDonald's was conceptualizing at that time was how to solve kind of two problems. One, the urgency of the moment where people are hoping that companies can be accountable. And then the second thing was they had all of these restaurants and communities that didn't want to do business in Black neighborhoods anymore. White franchise owners who saw residential shifts in racial demographics and who weren't down anymore. And McDonald's then said, okay, we can secure our investments by putting in these Black franchisees in places where white people no longer want to do business. And we can start to see ourselves and present ourselves as being on the right side of history. And so that's when you start to see this concerted effort to bring Black people into the franchising system. And those franchises were really successful very, very shortly after Black people had access to them. They were doing really well. And so then you start to see the expansion and the more targeting of the Black consumer.
Yeah, earlier in the book, you talked about these kind of spinoffs that kind of happened. So you had McDonald's. I mean, I guess a good one would have been from McDonald's, you have Taco Bell, and from Taco Bell, you have Del Taco, and then from Marriott, I think you have KFC or some of those small things
Mhm.
were kind of spinning off throughout that time. When Black franchisees got like a Herman Petty or any of those kind of those names that you highlight, was there any Black spinoffs directly from McDonald's? Were there people that were specifically Black franchisees that tried their hand at starting their own restaurants?
Yeah, this is an interesting story because it really highlights the differentials around capitalization and just access to wealth and privilege and lending. There were some Black entrepreneurs who saw what was happening with some of these mainstream franchises and said, look, we should try to build our own. And the second they did that, they were undermined because they just did not have the wealth to compete. So there's a guy who I talk about in the book and who I've done some other projects about called Brady Keys. And he was a member of, he was on the Steelers. And he had a really good football career, but back then you couldn't live on your NFL pension. It wasn't, people were not making brand deals the way that they were. You can not be very good on the field, but if you're kind of charismatic, you can sell products. That was not happening for Black athletes. And that didn't really happen until people like Rosie Greer and OJ Simpson. And so he wanted to start a fried chicken company. He called it All Pro Chicken. And the reason he got into fried chicken was because he couldn't get into car dealership franchising, which was super, super popular with athletes after they retired. So he saw that his only route was to try to do, fast food. So he tries to do All Pro Chicken. And he opens a few stores in Cleveland. He's got a store in New York City. And then the big guys come in, KFC comes in, and those guys can withstand economic instability. They can discount. There's another guy I talk about in my book who tries to do a place called Chicken George's, and it's very popular in the Northeast, in DC and Baltimore. And Popeyes comes in, and they can do discounting, and they can do coupons, and a lot of those kind of startups get acquired by the big guys eventually. They buy their restaurants, they've got the fryers, the materials. And so you start to see that it isn't because people aren't working hard enough or they don't have good ideas. They just don't have the capital to compete.
Yeah.
And so what you do see is that a lot of Black celebrities start to lease out their image and likeness to companies to give the impression that they're Black owned, but they aren't.
Yeah, and to the Chicken George point, because you kind of made that as one of the last efforts. I don't know. Have you seen any more recent efforts? Because I think about something like a Raising Cane's, for example. It started in 1996. You have, I think it was by Todd Graves. He ends up making it $1 billion company because he doesn't franchise it. Did you see any models like that for African American people that were trying to do businesses and they just stuck without franchising or anything?
I have not seen tons of examples of Black-owned restaurants that don't try to do the franchise model, or Black people who are very successful in the restaurant industry who aren't doing franchises. There's some local places like here in DC, Milk and Honey, that the guy who started it, I think, was a big franchise guy and then did his own restaurants. Franchising is a really, really tricky business and it can get very, very predatory really, really fast. The New York Times recently did a expose of Dickey's Barbecue.
Okay.
And all of these people, a lot of them, US military veterans who are able to access special business loans, have lost so much money because they tell them this is a $300,000 business and the business actually costs $600,000 to run, right? So I have yet to see, I've seen some very successful kind of local regional Black chains, but nothing again at the scale and the scope of some of the big fast food chains.
Yeah, and can we talk a little bit about, so they went from civil rights to silver rights was kind of the thing that they're trying to push. From your research, how successful was the Black capitalist movement post the riots, Martin Luther King assassination riots?
I would say that it was um, a systemic failure that allowed for individual success. And I think this is why it's sometimes a hard thing to talk about. Because for people who were able to get into franchising, people who were able to make a lot of money, this was a good business. This was a good deal. This was a good idea to try to really focus on Black capitalism as the next step in the civil rights struggle. But for every one person who became very wealthy or who could say this is success, there were thousands of people who were left behind. And I think that the fundamental problem is that these strategies, whether we call them empowerment, we call them investment, they actually don't lift people up in a massive way. They don't increase wages, they don't give better jobs, they don't, bring us towards free healthcare or free college or free childcare. They allow for some individuals to get very successful, and those same individuals can then say, see how easy it is, see how great it is. And so, I don't like to think about it necessarily as success or failure. I like to think about it as, did this moment teach us anything of value to set us up for critical and more thoughtful thinking in the future? And that I think is unfortunate too, because it didn't. Because right after the murder of George Floyd, we saw very similar things happening. And look where we are now in 2025. I mean, the retrenchment and the backlash has been swift. It has been initiated on the federal level, and more than anything else, it has made it impossible to try to make any kind of gains around equity, to even initiate that conversation, right? By essentially making it illegal. And so we have to be very careful about these strategies that overly rely on corporations and the marketplace to try to deliver justice.
No, that's a good point because you think about like people always talk about generational wealth, but that kind of creates a line of just like a lineage of your specific family, right? Because you have me, it's kind of like a me, my family, my this, my that. But when you think about kind of like what King was talking about, where he was like collective economics, that's more like liberational wealth, where it's like how can we collectively create an opportunity for more people to have, I guess, a larger demographic to win in these situations.
I think that we have to also redefine what generational wealth means. I think for many people, it means having lots of assets to pass on to future generations. And I think we need to think about it in terms of what skills, what talents, what stories, what life lessons, what values that we pass on to generations. Because not everyone will have millions of dollars in their estate upon their death. But what we will have is collective knowledge and collective experience that is also important to share and is also valuable.
Yep, I agree. So can we talk a little bit about how these fast food companies, specifically McDonald's, integrated into Black neighborhoods, what they provided? Because I think one of the interesting things was all of the programs that came about in McDonald's. You talked a little bit about things as obviously we know is the All-American basketball game, which ultimately one of the first people that were in that game. I had just read the book about Magic Johnson. He was one of the first or second people in that game, and now that's become one of the most important things from having LeBron and some of those people that have played in the All-American McDonald's games. Then you have these other programs. So can you talk about how much McDonald's was integrated in these communities and what they actually were able to do? Because I think there was a lot of good things and useful things that they did for the community.
Well, one of the things I like to talk about is that like fast food isn't just about the food, it's about the cultural climate and context that it creates. And when we talk about Black consumers in McDonald's, I can't think of a company that has done more in terms of creating an infrastructure around Black culture and Black cultural production. Because if you look at the early days of, for instance, the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, which McDonald's was one of the first corporations to really get behind and sponsor. If you look at, again, those athletic programs and not just All-American Basketball League, but you've got All-American Marching Band, you've got Double Dutch Leagues, you've got all of these different ways in which McDonald's is putting their logo on the Olympics, on really important sporting events, and they're also providing the opportunity for Black athletes to be the spokespeople. So the Williams sisters, Michael Jordan, LeBron, they've all done McDonald's commercials, right? And in a sense, what they're doing is they're creating, the kind of crossover marketing. They're no longer segmenting Black celebrities for Black consumers. These are for everybody, right? Because these people are so wildly popular. But I also wanted, when I was writing the book, I was talking about Black people in advertising and the advertising industry. And one of the things that's really, really important to note is that a lot of Black culture makers get their start doing television commercials. And I thought about it in terms of like, all of these backup singers, dancers, choreographers, talent, they are getting their start because there is this mechanism of Black advertising, and McDonald's is a large part of it for them to even be seen. If you go back on YouTube and you look at the Black McDonald's commercials from the 80s and 90s, you will see a lot of familiar people. Tyrese is in one of them. You'll see a lot of these people who, in a pre-social media world, getting that kind of come up and getting that attention, it's all being done on network television. So a lot of the people who are cast members on shows like The Cosby Show, like Different World, you can see them in these commercials.
Yeah.
And so becomes a very important mechanism for Black talent in an era, which I think we're still in which there are very few opportunities for Black on-screen talent.
Yeah, what was your experience like writing this book? Because at least for me, I remember going through, like when I first read it, and obviously we talked about the sit-ins. I'm saying like, all right, McDonald's is bad. I didn't know if I ever eat McDonald's again. Then you go into the next part where you're like, okay, McDonald's, kind of what you're saying. They're going over, like they're working incredibly hard, more than I've probably seen maybe mostly any company for Black community, trying to work with Black people, trying to they worked with obviously trying to do things with SNCC and NAACP, and they're working with all these people. No matter how much these protests are going on, they're actually trying to make opportunities. So then I'm like, all right, maybe I should support McDonald's. And it kind of was like I don't know how to explain it. It's like throughout the book, you get so many of these different moments where you're kind of going these ebb and flows of your connection and affinity to McDonald's. So as you were writing it, I'm kind of curious how you thought about that too.
I mean, it is a roller coaster. So McDonald's was a very important part of my childhood, and it was the center of a lot of our social life and a lot of our special occasions. I will never deny that. But I think as I get older, I get more discerning about how I want to invest my time and invest my money. And so it becomes something else, right? Like for me, it's a topic of research now. It's not a place I go all the time. It's a place my kid has been. I can't stop that. But I think what it is it's a mirror of just how complicated our country's history of trying to remedy racial discrimination and inequality is, right? McDonald's tells us a lot about how the private sector and corporations have been called upon and have volunteered themselves to do justice work, and it doesn't yield anything. It doesn't bring us the things that we want. But I think it's a fascinating case study. I think it's a fascinating institution. It provides us so many different windows into American culture and American life that I think it's important for people to kind of sit with it and grapple. I'm not calling for a widespread consumer boycott of McDonald's. If people want to do that, great. But I want them to understand that the things that they see in front of them always have more of a history and more of a depth than they could possibly imagine. And that no relationship to a market product or a company is like natural. There's nothing natural about Black folks eating McDonald's. It is a process that people had to be subject to, that had to be tested and manipulated in order for those connections to be made.
Yeah, and then on the point about the advertisement, I don't know if you saw it. I think it just came out yesterday, but Brian Allen, I guess kind of during the George Floyd era, had sued McDonald's for their
Yep.
inability to, I guess basically more or less they had committed to saying they're going to do enough advertising through Black people, and they ended up not doing it. And then I guess just yesterday it was announced that he had won that lawsuit. I guess even to that point, how do you think these, like when we talk about advertising and kind of like you talked about what's his name, Tommy Burrell, and some
Mhm.
of these people that have had these moments working with McDonald's, how is that, how have you thought about that relationship when it comes to advertisement and how we advertise to Black people as well?
Well, I think this is a tough one. The Byron Allen case is an interesting one because he was coming through in a period where it was either print, radio, or TV.
Mm.
That was the only way you got to consumers, and then billboards, right? And so a lot of the Black legacy publications like Essence and Jet, Ebony, they needed those dollars definitely from companies like McDonald's to not just sponsor events, but Black enterprise. They needed those advertisers, right? And that advertising revenue was key. And this was an age where you had Black advertising firms who, this was the only place where Black people in marketing could get jobs. So you had these really concentrated, segregated areas of professional life that then blew up because the white agencies started to just hire Black people or hire white people to do the ads, right? They
Yep.
figured we can do these ads too. And then social media blew up. And now it's a tweet about, your new burger might be more effective than
Yep.
paying millions of dollars to, advertise in magazines that don't even print monthly or weekly anymore. People don't watch network television, right? They're on streamers, so you may not advertise on streamers anymore, right? So there's all of these different ways that are cheaper and more efficient to capture those audiences that don't require huge client contracts. And so, what Byron Allen is reflecting on isn't just, and I think he's right, McDonald's lack of commitment to Black consumers anymore. It's also reflecting a new kind of advertising and media landscape that no longer needs Black people or Black institutions in order to reach Black consumers.
Yeah, a good point. And I want to talk a little bit about some of these Black franchisees because they went through a lot of major barriers to get to have this ownership in McDonald's. Can you talk about what some of those things that they faced in the 70s and 80s? And the reason I also asked that is because I looked at something the other day that I think we almost peaked at our Black franchisees peaked at about 400. McDonald's, and now the number's starting to come down to like 160 Black-owned franchisees. So talk about those, what they overcome, and then also maybe from your research, why you think that it slowly is starting to drift off.
Yeah, so in the early days of franchising, some of the challenges that Black franchisees faced was that they were often given restaurants that white franchisees didn't want. Sometimes they were damaged during uprisings. Sometimes they were just in neighborhoods where there was a lot of carrying costs for security, for training workers because of the lack of investment. They were often in urban areas that have higher taxes, higher real estate fees. So they were kind of put in this position where if this is all they're going to get, they're going to make the best of it. So a lot of these early franchise owners, banded together to try to figure out how to run these businesses. And that's where you get the origins of the National Black McDonald's Operators Association. But what started to happen over time is that people got more savvy and more access to capital. Because initially, part of the problem of why a lot of Black franchise owners eventually lost some of their businesses is because they didn't have access to bank lending. The banks were not lending to them, and McDonald's kind of stepped in order to facilitate that. But in some of the early days, people are talking about borrowing money from loan sharks and trying to get the money out of the registers before they come collect. So this was like really, really, really disorganized. But as they became more successful and started to make demands on McDonald's corporate, the thing that they had always really struggled with was the ability to get more than one or two restaurants. Because the ways that you really make money on these franchises is to be a multi-unit operator. And up until like 2020, 2021, there were still lawsuits saying that there was discrimination
Mm.
on the assignment of restaurants and, the process to get more than one restaurant. So one of the reasons why in this lawsuit that was filed a few years ago and in some of the chatter among the Black franchise community as to why those numbers are dwindling is because a lot of Black franchise owners were concentrated in cities that have had kind of really unique and distinct hits in the urban environment. So if you think about a city like Detroit or some parts of Chicago where you have a lot of depopulation,
Okay.
that's where the Black McDonald's is. When you look at places that have been really vulnerable to urban unrest, a lot of them are Black-owned spots. And if you look at things like Hurricane Katrina, places like New Orleans, Black cities, right? But during the COVID crisis, a lot of franchise owners, Black franchise owners, were in cities that took lockdown very seriously, like here in
Mm.
Washington, D.C. and in New York, places where people were not out. And so they say that, those challenges, coupled with the fact that when these Black franchise owners filed suit against McDonald's, McDonald's was unwilling to use their internal mechanisms to help out franchise owners. So like you can get some of your fees forgiven, you can get a deal on your real estate terms. There's different ways that McDonald's can work with a franchise owner in order to keep their franchise,
Yeah.
but they said that some people allege that that didn't happen. And so fewer people are staying in this business because it's becoming kind of impossible. Rising food costs, rising labor costs, all of the things that affect any business affect franchise businesses. And what people need to understand is the franchisee is on the hook to figure those things out, not the corporate parent.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I will say is I've heard from some people that part of the challenge also for some of the Black franchise owners is that franchises are not assets that you can leave for your family. You can leave your family the money you make from it, but you
Right.
can't leave them the business, that they have to be approved as franchise owners. And some franchisees are concerned that their kids are not able to inherit these businesses that they built. And part of the kind of promise of this business was that it could create that generational wealth. It can be an institution that gets passed down. And I think a lot of people are realizing that's not going to happen.
Wow, that's a good point. And my brain's kind of going two ways because on one hand, you have like kind of what you're talking about. There's this level of gentrification that was happening in these some of these McDonald's places, especially even because even in your book you talk about how a lot of times they were giving black people not the they weren't giving them the lack of better terms, they weren't giving them the Beverly Hills McDonald's. They were giving them the more the inner city kind of McDonald's. But then on the other hand, you also kind of when you talk about corporate, I think about from Ray Kroc where he talks about I think it was quality, service, cleanliness, and value
Mhm.
or something and how those were his big moments of pushing for things. But as you're saying, when you have these McDonald's that are completely underserved in their own spot, anyways, a lot of those values kind of become pushed onto black franchisees without the backing and the dollars of these things. So like my brain's kind of thinking in these two different ways, but kind of like how do you think about that? And then maybe even just some of the erasing of these crazy stories from all of McDonald's history because you don't hear it as much, even from the book. You don't see it from the movie. There's a lot of things that like
Oh, in the founder, yeah.
yeah, you
I
don't see
mean,
it in the movie. You don't see it in
well,
you don't, yeah.
you know, the majority of scholarship, representations of McDonald's history, even if the ones that aren't the most flattering towards Ray Kroc, because he was a really complicated person who struggled with addiction. And there's a really good book about him and his wife. His widow was an incredible donor to a lot of liberal causes, despite, his politics. I think it's called Joan and Ray. There's some really interesting books about some of these complexities. In my research, I found one book from the 70s that even talked about some of these racial issues at McDonald's. It is so easy to overlook that. In the same time, when you talk about McDonald's and Black people, most of the research is coming from a public health perspective about people, what they're eating, about the amount of advertisement to children of color in the fast food industry, the health implications for people with type 2 diabetes or heart disease. You see a lot of health stuff, right? Which
Yeah.
is important. But I think the context, the historical context that brought McDonald's to Black communities is also really important and is also something that we can't gloss over. And this idea that like this American company can be so innovative and so amazing, and there's no mention of the racial politics that allow business to grow in the 1950s is insulting, right? Because every business is confronting the question of civil rights. Every business that expands its physical footprint is probably tied into the highway system or suburbanization or white flight or redlining, right? Like everybody's implicated. And to think of McDonald's, who's so central to these processes, to not be considered in that light really does us a disservice, as just educated people to know what all of those stories are and what all those dynamics mean.
Yeah, I want to get into the health a little, kind of benefit. I mean, the health impacts of McDonald's a little bit too. But before that, I do want to get into the black dollar, just because I think about things like how McDonald black dollars help make McDonald's the number one fast food chain in the world. But now we're seeing things like boycotts with Target and how much black dollar still really can impact businesses. So like, how is the black dollar still? How do you think about the black dollar valued or undervalued? Even today.
It's amazing. I guess, Target is in the find out stage because McDonald's made a similar pronouncement that they were going to roll back their diversity goals. They did this like in November, December of 2024. And they had been on that collision course. I don't know. I think that this current administration has emboldened companies to do the things they were going to do anyway, and then say it's because they're worried about compliance. But I think what people don't understand is that the black dollar isn't just powerful because it's spent, it's how it's spent. And Black consumers are fiercely loyal because of this history, right? So if you think about, people will say folks like this type of place, Red Lobster or wherever. Sometimes it's not. And just like McDonald's, sometimes it's not about even the quality of what they're getting. And it's not about the fact that maybe they could afford something more expensive. It's the certainty that you will be treated a certain way or catered to in a certain way or seen in a certain way that makes it comfortable. And this is what McDonald's spent tons of money doing with their Black advertising campaigns and with their Black, owned places to say, this is a place that Black people know that if they go there, they'll be treated or they'll be welcomed in a certain way. During those years of uncertainty after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64, people wanted to reduce that anxiety, right? How will I be treated in this space? Fast forward today, the thing about Target is, Target is one of many companies that has rolled back DEI. But what Target did not understand fundamentally is its proximity to places that Black people shop. And so what they're doing, which is I think so interesting, is Target is like, well, now we're going to move more into small towns. And I was like, but again, the find out, it's this idea, it's these outdated ideas about where Black people live and how Black people engage. Because even if Target says, okay, we'll do more brick and mortar in places that, people don't care about our DEI boycott, there's still an expansive network of people who are still shopping online post-COVID. And there's still a number of urban stores that will not reclaim those dollars. So I think that it's so interesting because I think people imagine that even though we are in a more expansive period of time than, for instance, people who did the Montgomery bus boycott, consumer choice and consumer preference, I don't think that changes no matter how many choices you have. I have a million places where I can buy clothes, but I'm still buying clothes from one or two places that I've always bought clothes from, right? And so I think that, I think that I don't know what Target thought, but, you know, here they
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right on that because the other thing is, Target definitely didn't understand how much I guess black people enjoy Target because there's even, black people say, oh, Target. They'll say, I'm going to
Mhm.
Target. All of it's kind of ingrained in the culture. And then you had Target was one of the big components in black entrepreneurship. So you had a lot of people that
Mhm.
had products and CPG brands or consumer, product goods in Target. And I think there was a real relationship that black people, I mean, I guess Target must have not have seen it, but that had really, black people had a strong affinity for Target over even places like even Walmart, even though black people shop a lot of Walmart as well. But
Well, and I also think that it's like, it's part of the brand, but also Target is filled with stuff you don't need. That's how Target makes their money. It's not the Tide. It's the like, oh, this is cute. Tabitha Brown has a little t-shirt. Okay, I'm gonna buy this little like, this sweatshirt that has an Afro pick. This is kind of cute. That's how Target makes their money, I believe. And so when people are not going into a Target, and when people are being disciplined about how they're spending their money, it's like all these people went to Costco. Target has a lot more interesting and fun things to buy, but Costco has the necessities, and Costco did not make this, turn. And so people are like, okay, I'm just going to buy my laundry detergent. And I guess in this economy, I really shouldn't be buying things I don't need anyway. And so I think that there are a lot of different consumer motivations on why people distancing themselves from Target didn't hurt them as much as a consumer as maybe they even first thought they would, or even Target said, like, okay, people will come back. And they just didn't.
No, that's a good point. I think about it even from like my economics class where we talk about normal goods and luxury goods and kind of what your point, like Target has those moments of just those luxury goods that's like, oh, I got all the other good stuff. Let me just go ahead and get this because it makes sense to have at my house. I do want to talk a little bit because of kind of some of the areas that we're in. I want to talk about some of those black entrepreneurs like we talked about. I didn't know Mahalia Jackson had Glory Fried Chicken. I didn't know even as big of a Muhammad Ali fan, I didn't know about Champ Burger and some of those things. Obviously, we talked about Chicken George. Can you talk about the pressure of black businesses and how heavy it was in those moments for them to try to first get into the franchise? I mean, black restaurant tiering, I guess, and that, even though it wasn't perfect, like you just talk about that movement of some of those celebrities getting in there. I guess I forgot James Brown as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these were like not real. Like a lot of them were, again, using their image and likeness. But this is a period of time, again, where Black celebrities aren't making money in the ways that you think they should or they wanted to. Aretha Franklin saying, James Brown saying, pay me in cash before I even get on stage because they had been used to being ripped off. People like Mahalia Jackson was like, run me my check in cash because I don't know if I can trust you, right? So a lot of these people are very anxious about holding on to their money. And so when franchising becomes really popular in the 50s, everyone is like, this is a kind of it's the way people talk about crypto. Like, this is the wave of the future. This is how you're going to always make money. This is going to be passive income. And so a lot of these Black celebrities, they get into these deals for a few $100,000 or less, and they're using their face and name. So Mahalia Jackson, her company was owned by two white lawyers based out in Tennessee, and they had another company called Minnie Pearl's Chicken, which was a white country music star. So it's like white folks have that chicken and Black folks have this chicken. Muhammad Ali's Champ Burger was again, it was a corporation that was largely white owned, but they're using the champ, right? And they're using his face and his name. And so a lot of these businesses that celebrities were in were part of them kind of expanding their portfolio because they still kind of needed money. And they were wildly popular, and there wasn't a way, and I think in some ways for them, it was a way of doing segregated business without doing segregated performance. Because by 1968, 1969, most of the big players were like, we're not going to, even prior to that, they said, we're not going to play in front of segregated audiences. People like Ray Charles, people like, um, Sam Davies Jr., after a certain while, they're like, this doesn't feel right. We're not going to do this. But on the other hand, they also knew how much Black people love them. And
Yep.
so these restaurants, I think, in many ways was a way of still targeting that audience without having to do segregated performance, which felt like degrading. But at the end of the day, these people did not own these businesses. They did not own these companies. These were not authentically Black owned. And we see versions of that, right?
Yep.
In prior political moments when, people would say this is a minority owned business, and you're like, who exactly is owning the business? And it's like four white dudes and five white women, and one Black person will be the face of it or will be the person who, shifts that balance. So you saw some of that stuff in the industry as well.
Yeah, I think also it's just timing too, right? Because a lot of this thing, if you think about like in NIL deals and athletic environments, and now you have creator economy, you might have someone that starts a YouTube channel that can now build out a whole brand, and some of those things does come down to moment and timing. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about this historical context and how to, because I think historical clarity matters, right? And how we navigate some of these current moments. How did you kind of, when you're writing this book, did you think about historical clarity for readers and how they can now, look at McDonald's as a whole, and not just what I eat there, but the whole penetration that it's had in Black communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to be very clear about just how unusual this opportunity would have been for a Black entrepreneur and just how unusual the moment was and why people seized on it. Because I'm not in the business of judging why people made a decision if they didn't know the outcome and I do, right? Like that's not unfair that I get to live in the future and I see what happens. People are making decisions based on the information and the context they have available for them. And, from the vantage point of 1968 or 1969, this is the best opportunity that could happen to anyone,
Yeah.
right? But with that being said, I also like to highlight that at every moment, there are voices that are saying, I don't know about this, or this approach might be a little off, or like, you know what, we saw what happened over here. That might happen over here also, because there had been a long standing movement throughout the 60s to try to do more Black-owned businesses to kind of repair Black communities. And every time people tried to open a business, they wouldn't get the funding. And even if they did get the funding, the treatment they would get as Black business owners wouldn't be worth it. Or they were closed because, they were unwilling to align with kind of the politics of the federal government at the time. So there have been these indications that, this could go a little sideways or this could go left. But, recognizing and honoring the fact that people were operating with limited information and a great deal of anxiety and a great deal of hope to make transformation, and understanding that even in every period of time, there were people like, I don't know about this, and
Right.
bringing them together in one story helps us understand the complexities of making any kind of decision.
Yeah, and to that point, why do you think that the Black capitalism movement and the pairing of fast food worked at a higher level then than when I even think about something now with like DEI and some of those George Floyd moments? Because to your point, there was that window in 2020 where it seemed like this kind of similar kind of historical moments kind of had their opening again, right? So with the George Floyd and in 2020, you saw a lot of DEI movements, a lot of opportunities for Black capitalism to come back in and have its moment. Kind of the similar you've seen after the assassination of Martin Luther King. But what made that moment more? I guess why they seize that opportunity at such a higher level than say even what happened kind of in the DEI moment.
Well, it's interesting you say that because in the 60s, it was a very limited opportunity, and they kind of knew only a handful of people would be able to actually do it. Like the number of people who had the skill, experience, drive, motivation to franchise a McDonald's, those are very few people. And the investment in those people was considered like one and done.
Yeah.
By the time we get to George Floyd, we have a far more, a deeper and wider pool of educated Black folks. We have all these different mechanisms of what we call racial repair. We have people wanting to buy books. We have people wanting to do documentaries. We've got speakers. We've got all, I think the idea of what DEI looks like expanded so much that the investment didn't have to be so extreme,
Mm.
right? We could say, well, we're not going to give this potential multi-million dollar business opportunity to Black folks. Like, we don't have to do all that. We can have a speaker series. We can have a DEI VP and let them hire two people, right?
Yep.
Like, I think that corporate America had learned that the business investment thing works and is a good symbol, but there was no expectation that that kind of capital investment would happen over and over again.
Yeah, and to be honest, it might not even be the right question because if you think about this time period, you have the immigration law that comes in 1965, which also now DEI looks a lot different than just how do we
Mhm.
serve African Americans. It's like how do we serve all types of backgrounds and ethnicities and everything in between. So I think that's all. You got to look at it. It's a lot more. It's a lot heavier of a question now than it was back then.
Hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about just that the health because I think one of the things you can't. It's hard to talk about McDonald's and fast food in general without the health and the moments that have happened because of McDonald's and fast food coming into urban communities. Talk about that because I think on one hand you'll be in you'll say okay Starbucks and Panera and all these places like oh go eat there. But there's like this illusion of health to those versus like a McDonald's where you're like okay it's a detriment. So can you talk kind of about those health labels and kind of the unhealthiness of McDonald's and how does that kind of compare to race, class, and branding of these different type of fast foods that you see in different communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I try to be really careful about talking about like health stuff because I'm not a health, I'm not a that kind of doctor. But I do think it's important to note that, when people were talking about concerns about the quality of fast food. They were doing it from a perspective of a growing understanding of kind of nutrition and food quality and health outcomes. And that doesn't really come into the late 80s or early 90s because there were different portion size, because there was kind of less availability of food everywhere. Like everywhere you can buy food now, and before it wasn't really like that. But I do think that the implication that the problem is that individual people are eating McDonald's loses sight of the kind of broader story about food. And so I'm always really cautious about not just saying, okay, fast food is the problem. It's living in an environment and a society where people have no time for rest. They don't have access to healthcare. They don't have access to enough sidewalks for walking. They don't have access to, places where you don't need a car. So it's more about how McDonald's fits within a toxic ecosystem of lifestyle and quality of life and wages and opportunities to cook and be in community that is missing, right? So I would never say McDonald's is the reason why, there's all of these health disparities. I would say McDonald's fits perfectly into an environment that exacerbates health disparities.
Yeah, that's a good point. And well, just some of the stats you kind of had in the book where I've seen them before, but to see them kind of written in paper was kind of crazy. You said like since like 2000, there was a 50% chance of Black children developing some form of diabetes. It said 75% of adults were either overweight or Black adults were overweight or considered obese. Like, how does this kind of like tie into fast food marketing, systemic, and kind of what you're talking about right there, like systemic access issues? Because I think about food deserts as kind of these things where, at least because I went to school at Morehouse College. So on one hand, you have like this a very nice campus, but then outside of it, you have Vine City and the West End where it's really hard to get healthy groceries. Right, the
Mhm.
closest Kroger is 5+ miles away. But so I think a lot of times we look at these kind of like you're saying these systems where like all right 75% this, but you're not talking about how hard it is to kind of get these grocery stores and all those things. How when you're writing and think about that, how do you think about those access points?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that there's no real incentives to create those types of businesses, right? For a long portion of the history I write about, the Small Business Administration considered fast food restaurants small businesses for loan purposes, and grocery stores were not, right? And when we think about the bottom line and the margins, grocery stores have very thin margins, fast food has better margins. And so sometimes during this period in which Black capitalism was getting so much attention, sometimes Black communities wanted to open grocery stores. They couldn't get funding to do it. But if they wanted to do a fast food restaurant, they had easier access. And so you start to see the structural reasons behind some of the things that people look at today and say, well, why don't people do this? Why don't people do that? It's like, well, it's been made impossible to do those very things that would benefit the community.
Yeah, I agree. And it's just like I said, it's challenging. You got like Popeyes right here. You got churches there, and then not to mention, you're talking about how much money you might be able to spend on any given week.
Yep.
Sometimes those are just the choices that you have, and it just really is tough. So I understand, especially like reading the book and kind of seeing being in those environments, you see how tough and how easy it is to be just like, all right, McDonald's is Monday through Friday, and that's what we're gonna eat. But the classic Martin Luther King question is, where do we go from here? Kind of just like when we talk about how do we kind of on one hand protect Black businesses, but then also talk about how do we help kind of protect the health and ownership and kind of the dignity. So like all those things, there's a lot there in that question, but kind of like where do you think you go from here with what you've learned and from this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we ask different questions. Instead of saying, how is this going to generate wealth? I think the question is, how does this really lift people and communities? It's not about, how many founders are we going to have and how many, Black millionaires are we going to have? It's like, how many people are going to live a life that's free of the violence of poverty? I think, King asked the question and he answered it. How do we step away from, the three evils of militarism, racism, and capitalism towards something else, something that's kind of more viable? And so I think that for everyday people, you have to ask yourself a question. If a business says that they're going to liberate and free people, ask them how exactly they do that and attend to the bottom line at the same time. And if they don't have a viable answer, don't believe them. If there's a politician who says they're going to empower people, and you say, okay, well, then how many people are no longer going to be hungry? How many people are going to have homes now? How many schools are going to be free now because of it? And they don't, and they say, well, we have business loans. Don't believe them, right? Like there are all of these things that we see are fundamental problems of society. And we have to start believing that we as communities, we as people answer those questions. We don't have corporations answer those questions for us. And I think once we have that kind of clarity about our capacity to actually attend and take care of people, I think we make better decisions about how we're going to interact with corporations and businesses that claim that they have all the answers.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Let's talk a little bit about just your writing process. What was the writing process like for a book like this, and what do you consider a perfect day of writing? How does that look for you?
I always tell people who are, other writers that you have to understand that very few people will ever live a life that's so uncomplicated that you can have one process through your whole life. There are few people who can do that. But for me, writing franchise was during a period of my life in which I was traveling a lot, I was speaking a lot, I was doing, different kind of consulting and advising gigs. So franchise was a pleasure to write because every time I visited an archive, there was a discovery, there was a new dimension about McDonald's that I didn't even know was there. And so it was really exciting. I physically went to a lot of places. I got on an airplane, went to Portland 3 times, go to LA twice, go to Chicago 5 times, go to New York 3 times. I physically went to a lot of places to do the archival research because in that stage of my life, pre-COVID, pre-kid, I could do that.
Yeah.
Um, and so a perfect writing day would be for me, taking a flight from DC to Portland, setting my timer, taking a 1 hour nap, writing for 2 hours on the plane, grading papers for that last hour of the flight, getting into Portland, first thing in the morning, hit the archive. Later that day, looking at my images from the archive, writing a little bit more in the airport lounge, heading back home, kind of getting it in where it could fit in. That was how I wrote. Um, I just finished the second draft of a book and as a mom. And so now it's, some mornings it's 5 a.m. to 7 a.m., do a little writing, get my kid off to school, and then, do my business during the day, and then, have a writing session with my writing group from 1 to 3 o'clock. After 3 o'clock, I don't do any more thinking.
Yeah.
3 o'clock, it is done.
Over with.
I'm shut until the next morning. And that is going to be my process, until my kid is, I have a really athletic kid. So who knows what kind of sports he's going to be in. And then during that time, it might be waiting in the car for practice to finish, writing in the car, on the laptop, taking notes on my phone. As a writer, I think you have to be flexible to understand that your life is going to look different and you still write. I was just talking to a good friend. There are days where I'm like, what am I doing? Why am I writing a big book? I have a small kid. I can't do both at the same time. This is too much. But I'm like, well, what else am I going to be doing, right? I still have the ideas. I still have to tend to that part of me. It just looks a lot different than it used to.
Okay, sounds good. Is the name of the book out yet, or do we have any information there? Or It's still in the works.
No, marketing will probably decide, but it is a new look at the 1963 March on Washington. That's what I will say.
Okay, sounds good. Is there any books that we should be reading, or any podcasts, or any documentaries that kind of are in conversation with your book, or anything in that area?
Yeah, there's some good stuff. My colleague Shinjo, who teaches now at Rice University, wrote a book called Supersizing Urban America, which is really fundamental for my research, and we talk about some of the similar things, but from a different approach. That's really good. There's a documentary about kind of the Black Panther Party for self-defense that I think is always really good for people to understand, like kind of Black radicalism and Black nationalism by the filmmaker Stanley Nelson. That's a good one. And there was a podcast that called Rip Current by a podcasting person who I really like named Toby Ball that talks about the Patty Hearst kidnapping, but he talks about it from the perspective of all the political stuff that happened before, and a lot of that is tied into Black radicalism in the 60s and 70s in San Francisco. So Rip Current's really good, and I'm always reading something. I listen to like 7 or 8 podcasts a week.
Oh yeah.
I really like to just kind of keep my brain moving and off of social media as much as I can.
Perfect. All right. So the way we always end this podcast, I mean, yeah, you can answer it however you want, but what should be in a writer's toolkit?
Oh man, a big cup of coffee. A writer should always have like 3 or 4 running documents, places to dump different ideas as they come, because there's nothing worse than like, oh, I was thinking about this thing and you forgot to write it down. You
Sure.
always have to have your tabs open. I always like have like 100 tabs open, but something you want to go back to, places to deposit your idea. And I always have a file when I'm really writing called overmatter, stuff that makes no sense, stuff that does not belong in this book, but is compelling to me. I try to keep it in a file because you never know when you're going to write an editorial. You never know when you're going to be asked to write a short piece. You never know when you have to write a speech. And I always have like what I call my entry and exit points. So everything I write is like a freeway. There's an entry point and then there's an exit point. And sometimes I don't even know what the whole thing's going to be, but I'm like, okay, my entry point is going to be this vignette from King's life, or my entry point is going to be this poster I saw of McDonald's, whatever it is. And then my exit point is going to be like this major argument. And I keep a file of them so that, the writer's block can kind of stay away because I've got some ideas to work on.
See, I love that. All right, thank you so much, Dr. Chatelain. Everybody, make sure you get your
Thank
copy
you.
of the franchise. It's a tremendous book. One of those books that I could say really changed my thought process and just the way I see things. I think it's always really cool to have those books that are really like, they upgrade your how you think. So thank you, Dr.
My
Chatelain, so
pleasure.
much. It's truly a pleasure
All
talking with
right.
you.